8:31 a.m. The Persian Gulf. The sky is a hard, bleached white, the color of heated metal, the kind of sky that exists over the Gulf in late summer when the humidity sits at 90% and the air shimmers in columns above the concrete of every airfield and every road. Visibility at ground level is reduced by haze. But at 40,000 feet, the air is clear, the sensors are sharp, and the MQ-9 Reaper operating on a classified surveillance circuit over the central Gulf had been doing its job without incident for 6 hours and 42 minutes. Call sign Shadow 7, operated remotely by a crew at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, assigned to monitor Iranian maritime activity in the northern Gulf. Armed with 2 AGM-114 Hellfire missiles and the 2 GBU-12 paveway laser-guided bombs, standard configuration for a persistent surveillance and strike-ready platform. Her sensors had been recording everything below her: ship movements, coastal activity, radar emissions, and transmitting it in real time to the Intelligence Fusion Cell at 5th Fleet Headquarters in Bahrain. At 8:31 a.m., Shadow 7's data link went silent. In the ground control station at Al Udeid, the sensor operator registered the loss of communication link in the same second it occurred. The mission intelligence coordinator began running the diagnostic sequence. The pilot attempted to re-establish the uplink on the primary frequency, then the backup frequency, then the tertiary emergency channel. 60 seconds, 90 seconds, 2 minutes, nothing. Shadow 7 was gone. What the crew at Al Udeid did not yet know. What would become clear over the following 4 hours through signals intelligence collection, satellite imagery analysis, and a grainy video that appeared on Iranian state television at 12:47 p.m. was that the MQ-9 had not malfunctioned. It had been taken. The IRGC Electronic Warfare Division had been working on the problem of American surveillance drones over the Gulf for 3 years. Their approach was not to shoot the drone down. A kinetic engagement would be instantly attributable and would trigger an immediate U.S. military response. Their approach was subtler, more technically ambitious, and in the assessment of the IRGC's aerospace engineers, more strategically rewarding. They had developed a GPS spoofing system, a ground-based transmitter array positioned on the Iranian coast near Bandar Abbas, capable of feeding false GPS coordinates to an aircraft whose navigation was GPS-dependent, gradually and imperceptibly walking its navigation solution away from its true position until the aircraft believed it was somewhere it was not, and responded to spoofed landing guidance by descending to a prepared landing strip on Iranian soil. The technique required patience, precision, and a target aircraft whose GPS receiver was accessible to external manipulation. The MQ-9 Reaper, operating on standard navigation protocols, had that vulnerability. The IRGC had spent 16 months refining their spoofing system against captured telemetry data from previous Reaper operations. They had practiced the technique in simulation hundreds of times, and at 8:19 a.m., 12 minutes before the Al Udeid crew registered the loss of their data link, they had begun feeding Shadow 7 false coordinates that slowly, invisibly redirected her toward a prepared landing strip at Qeshm Island. Shadow 7 landed at Qeshm Island at 8:44 a.m. She was intact. Her sensors were intact. Her 2 remaining Hellfire missiles were intact. Her paveway bombs were intact. Her fuel tanks were 60% full. The Iranian state television video that appeared at 12:47 p.m. showed IRGC aerospace engineers standing beside the intact Reaper on the Qeshm Island airstrip. The video lasted 47 seconds. It was seen by 40 million people within 3 hours of its posting. In Washington, the National Security Council convened at 9 a.m. Before the video appeared, operating on the signals intelligence, reporting that had already identified the GPS spoofing operation and assessed Shadow 7's likely location. The meeting was brief. The principals were in agreement. The assessment was that Iran intended to exploit the captured Reaper in one or more of the following ways: reverse-engineered sensors and electronic systems for intelligence value, use it as a propaganda asset to embarrass the United States, or, most dangerously, attempt to reactivate its weapons systems and deploy the aircraft against a U.S. ally in the Gulf region, creating an incident designed to appear attributable to the United States. The third scenario was assessed as most likely. Iranian electronic warfare engineers had already demonstrated the capability to access the MQ-9's navigation system. The jump from navigation access to weapons system access was technically significant, but not impossible. Intelligence reporting indicated that an IRGC drone warfare unit had been practicing exactly this type of capability against captured drone telemetry for 18 months. Shadow 7 was armed. She was on Iranian soil, and the IRGC had a motive, a capability, and a time frame. The National Security Council authorized a response at 9:14 a.m. The response had two components. First, recover or render inoperable Shadow 7 before Iran could exploit her weapons systems. Second, degrade the IRGC electronic warfare capability that had made the capture possible and send a message about the consequences of interfering with U.S. military assets. Iran had made 5 catastrophic mistakes. First mistake: the GPS spoofing operation's electronic signature had been detected and attributed. The IRGC's ground-based transmitter array on the Iranian coast near Bandar Abbas had been active for 16 months, conducting low-power tests that it believed were below the detection threshold of U.S. signals intelligence collection. It was wrong. The NSA's collection architecture had been logging the transmitter's emissions since its third operational test, 14 months earlier. The precise location, the technical parameters, and the operational signature of the array were already in the targeting database at CENTCOM before Shadow 7 ever took off on her final mission. The targeting package had been built, reviewed, and preloaded into strike assets as part of a contingency plan specifically developed for the scenario of an Iranian drone capture. When Shadow 7 went offline, the first call from the Al Udeid ground control station went simultaneously to 5th Fleet and to the CAOC. The CAOC already had the spoofing array's coordinates on the targeting display. Second mistake: Qeshm Island was comprehensively covered by U.S. surveillance. The island's airstrip, its facilities, and its approaches were under continuous monitoring by a second MQ-9 operating at high altitude on a classified circuit that Iran had no awareness of. When Shadow 7 descended to the Qeshm airstrip at 8:44 a.m., the second MQ-9 sensors recorded the landing in high-resolution infrared and electro-optical detail. The images showed IRGC personnel approaching the aircraft within seconds of its landing rollout. They showed the vehicle convoy that arrived to secure the aircraft. They showed the facility buildings adjacent to the strip where the IRGC intended to conduct their exploitation work. Every detail of Iran's post-capture handling plan was visible in real time to U.S. intelligence analysts who were watching from 40,000 feet. Third mistake: the Reaper's self-destruct protocols had been partially activated by the Al Udeid crew within 90 seconds of losing the data link. The MQ-9 carries classified avionics and sensor packages, whose compromise is governed by standing emergency destruction protocols. The crew at Al Udeid, operating under those protocols the moment the data link was lost, had transmitted a partial destruct sequence on all available frequencies before the aircraft landed. The sequence had not fully executed. The communications blackout created by the IRGC spoofing operation had degraded the uplink sufficiently to prevent complete protocol execution, but it had successfully corrupted the primary sensor package's onboard storage, wiping the most sensitive accumulated collection data. Iran had captured an intact airframe. They had not captured intact sensor data from 6 hours and 42 minutes of surveillance over the Central Gulf. Fourth mistake, the IRGC's exploitation timeline was far too slow for the situation they had created. Their plan assumed they had 72 hours before any U.S. response could be organized, authorized, and executed against Qeshm Island. The assumption was based on their assessment of American decision-making timelines. The bureaucratic consultations, the legal reviews, the political deliberations that they believed would consume days before any kinetic response was authorized. The assumption was wrong by a factor of approximately 60. The National Security Council had authorized the response at 9:14 a.m., 43 minutes after Shadow 7 went offline, and 90 minutes before the IRGC engineering team had even completed their initial assessment of the aircraft's systems. The strike packages were in the air before Iran had finished celebrating their capture. Fifth mistake, the weapons systems aboard Shadow 7 were not accessible to external manipulation without triggering a permanent lock that U.S. engineers had incorporated into the aircraft's weapons management software. Following a previous Iranian drone capture, the lock was not publicized. It was not mentioned in any open-source documentation. It was a quiet engineering addition, a cryptographic protocol that rendered the weapons management system permanently inoperable in response to any attempted external access that did not match a continuously rotating authorization code held only by the aircraft's operating unit. The moment the IRGC's engineers attempted to interface with the weapons management system at 10:22 a.m., the Hellfire missile's firing circuits permanently disabled. The Paveway bomb's guidance systems permanently disabled. Shadow 7's weapons, the armament that Iran intended to turn against a Gulf ally, had become inert ballast before the IRGC engineers understood what had happened. What happened in the next 53 minutes rendered Shadow 7 inoperable, eliminated the IRGC's GPS spoofing capability, and dismantled the Qeshm Island facility where the exploitation operation was being conducted. At 9:22 a.m., 8 minutes after the National Security Council's authorization, 4 FA-18E Super Hornets launched from USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, which had been operating in the Gulf of Oman and had been placed on strike alert at 8:35 a.m. 4 minutes after Shadow 7 went offline, the Super Hornets' primary mission was direct action against the GPS spoofing transmitter array near Bandar Abbas. The array's coordinates were preloaded. The targeting solution was current. At 9:47 a.m., 4 GBU-31 JDAM precision guided bombs separated from the Super Hornets at medium altitude and descended on the transmitter facility. 3 achieved direct hits. 1 impacted within 4 meters of the facility's primary antenna structure, the GPS spoofing array, the system that had taken 16 months to develop and had successfully captured one of the most capable surveillance drones in the U.S. inventory, ceased to exist as an operational capability in the same second that the first JDAM impacted its antenna farm. Simultaneously, at 9:22 EOM, 2 F-35C Lightning IIs launched from USS Eisenhower on a separate mission, direct action against Shadow 7 herself. The objective was to render the aircraft permanently inoperable before Iranian engineers could extract additional intelligence value from her sensors, her communication systems, or her airframe. The F-35Cs carried GBU-53 Small Diameter Bomb 2, the precision glide weapon designed for exactly this type of target. A small, specific aim point on an airfield surrounded by other structures that must not be damaged. The SDB II's tri-mode seeker, combining millimeter wave radar, infrared imaging, and GPS guidance, could strike an aim point the size of a briefcase at ranges exceeding 60 miles. The Qeshm Island airstrip was 61 miles from the F-35C's release point when the weapons were released at 9:44 a.m. 2 SDB IIs, each programmed to impact a specific structural point on Shadow 7's airframe. The avionics bay and the engine nacelle guided themselves to their aim points through 41 miles of flight over international waters and 17 miles of Iranian airspace, approaching from below radar coverage, their own radar cross-sections invisible to the air defense systems on Qeshm. The first SDB II impacted Shadow 7's avionics bay at 9:51 a.m. The second impacted the engine nacelle 11 seconds later. Shadow 7 was rendered permanently inoperable on the Qeshm airstrip. The IRGC engineers who had been working on the aircraft were evacuated from the area by the blast concussion before the second impact. No IRGC personnel were reported as having sustained fatal outcomes in the immediate strike. The aircraft, the intelligence asset, the weapons platform, the propaganda trophy was reduced to inoperable wreckage in 11 seconds. At 9:31 a.m., 2B-1B Lancer bombers holding on alert over the Central Gulf received their strike tasking from CENTCOM. Their targets were the Qeshm Island IRGC drone warfare facility and the IRGC electronic warfare R&D compound near Bandar Abbas, where the GPS spoofing technology had been developed. Each B-1B carried 24 GBU-31 JDAMs. The Qeshm Island facility's three main buildings, the engineering workshop, the telemetry computing center, and the communications building, were rendered inoperable in 90 seconds. The mainland R&D facility received 36 JDAMs combined. The $400 million compound was comprehensively rendered inoperable. Secondary detonations from fuel storage burned for 3 hours. At 9:48 a.m., 4 additional FA-18E Super Hornets from USS Eisenhower struck the IRGC Naval Air Station on Qeshm Island's eastern coast. The facility that had provided logistics support for the drone capture operation, and from which the IRGC had been coordinating their Gulf surveillance activities that had enabled the spoofing operations' timing and targeting. 4 GBU-31 JDAMS targeted the station's operations building, its communications infrastructure, its fuel storage, and the hard stand where 4 IRGC maritime patrol aircraft were parked. All 4 aircraft were rendered inoperable on the ground. The operations building and communications infrastructure were comprehensively struck. EA-18G Growlers from USS Eisenhower had been maintaining a jamming architecture over the operational area from 9:15 a.m. onward, flooding the Iranian coastal air defense frequencies that covered the Qeshm and Bandar Abbas areas, with broadband interference that degraded any coherent radar tracking of the inbound strike packages. Iranian air defense operators in the Qeshm and Bandar Abbas sectors found their displays dissolving into noise at the exact moment that the F-35Cs and Super Hornets crossed into their coverage areas. By 10:24 a.m., 53 minutes after the strike packages launched, the operational assessment was complete. Shadow 7, rendered permanently inoperable on Qeshm Island airstrip at 9:51 a.m., before Iran extracted additional intelligence value from her sensor systems, before her weapons could be activated, and 47 minutes before the IRGC state television video appeared, and before Tehran was aware that the U.S. had already acted. The weapons systems had been permanently locked at 10:22 a.m., 2 minutes before the SDB IIs impacted, when the IRGC engineers triggered the cryptographic lock. The sequence was almost simultaneous. The Reaper was inoperable before Tehran knew the aircraft's weapons were inaccessible. GPS spoofing transmitter array near Bandar Abbas, rendered inoperable by 4 JDAM impacts, assessed as non-recoverable. The 16 months of development and the operational capability it represented, eliminated. Qeshm Island, IRGC drone, warfare exploitation facility, rendered inoperable. 3 buildings incapacitated. 18 months of captured U.S. drone telemetry analysis. rendered inaccessible as a result of computing facility incapacitation. IRGC electronic warfare, R&D facility near Bandar Abbas, comprehensively rendered inoperable. $400 million investment, total loss. Follow-on GPS spoofing program development capability, eliminated for a minimum of 3 to 5 years based on post-strike infrastructure assessment. IRGC Naval Air Station, Qeshm Island. 4 maritime patrol aircraft rendered inoperable on the ground. Operations and communications infrastructure incapacitated. IRGC personnel who sustained fatal outcomes across all strike packages. 87. U.S. personnel who sustained fatal outcomes, 0. U.S. aircraft rendered inoperable, 0. Shadow 7's sensitive collection data, successfully protected by partial destruct protocol executed by Al-Udeid crew. Shadow 7's weapons systems, never successfully activated by IRGC. 0 Allied targets engaged by captured U.S. weapons. The Iranian state television video that appeared at 12:47 p.m. showed IRGC engineers standing proudly beside an intact MQ-9 on a Qeshm Island airstrip. What it did not show, because it had been filmed at 9:15 a.m., 3 hours before broadcast, was that the aircraft in the video had been permanently inoperable for 56 minutes before the video was posted. The engineers standing beside it had been evacuated from the facility 4 hours before the broadcast. The building behind them in the video was a smoking ruin by the time their audience watched them smile. In Tehran, the IRGC Aerospace Force commander who had authorized the GPS spoofing operation had designed it as a strategic masterstroke. Capture an American surveillance drone intact, extract its sensors, its software, its electronic architecture, activate its weapons, turn an American military asset against an American ally in an incident that would create chaos, confusion, and political rupture in the U.S. alliance network across the Gulf. The operation had a certain elegance. It had been 17 months in preparation. It had worked, technically, in its first phase. The drone had been captured intact. Everything after that had gone precisely as the United States had planned, and Iran had not anticipated. The self-destruct protocols had protected the sensitive data. The cryptographic weapons lock had rendered the armament inoperable. The surveillance coverage of Qeshm had been continuous and undetected. The National Security Council had authorized the strike response in 43 minutes, rather than the 72 hours Iran had calculated. And the entire IRGC electronic warfare capability that had made the capture possible, the GPS spoofing array, the R&D facility, the exploitation center, had been rendered inoperable before Tehran had finished composing its triumphant statement for state television. The video that Iran broadcast at 12:47 p.m. became, by 2 p.m., something different from what it was intended to be. It was not a demonstration of Iranian capability and American vulnerability. It was a timestamp that established exactly how long Iran had held a captured American drone before the United States rendered it inoperable, eliminated the technology behind its capture, and dismantled the facility where the exploitation was being conducted. The timestamp read, 2 hours and 20 minutes. 2 hours and 20 minutes from capture to inoperable wreckage. 53 minutes of actual strike operations, and the entire IRGC program that had produced the capability. 4 years of construction, $400 million, 16 months of operational development. Gone by noon. At 1 p.m., the CAOC at Al-Udeid transmitted a new MQ-9 Reaper to her patrol station over the Central Gulf. Different call sign, same mission, same surveillance circuit, same international airspace, same Gulf waters that the United States Navy and Air Force had been patrolling for decades and would continue to patrol regardless of what any adversary attempted. The patrol continued, As it always does, this is what happens when you attempt to capture American military technology and turn it against American allies. You do not get 72 hours to conduct your exploitation undisturbed. You get 43 minutes before the National Security Council has authorized the response. You find that the drone's sensitive data was protected by protocols that executed the moment your spoofing operations started. You find that the weapons you intended to activate were locked behind cryptographic protocols you did not know existed and triggered permanently by your own engineer's access attempt. You find that your GPS spoofing array, the system you spent 16 months developing, is rendered inoperable by 4 JDAMs before your engineers finish their first pass of the captured aircraft. You find that your R&D facility, your exploitation center, your $400 million investment in drone capture technology are all inoperable wreckage before your state television broadcast of the capture has reached its first million views. The MQ-9 you captured was inoperable before you knew its weapons were locked, and the technology you built to capture it no longer exists. The Gulf is still being patrolled by another aircraft on the same circuit, at the same altitude, because the United States does not abandon its surveillance responsibilities in international airspace because an adversary attempted an interference operation and paid the full price for trying. The patrol never stopped,